With audacity so typical among conspiracy theorists, Mr. Rene has concluded that Newton's universal law of gravitation is flawed. This law has been tested and validated to a high degree of accuracy by physicists for the last 400 years, but Rene presumes to be smarter and more observant than all of them combined. His criticism is based on the movement of the moon around the Earth. The moon orbits the Earth at a speed of about 1 kilometer per second in this direction, looking down from above the North Pole. The Earth is shown to the left and the Sun is far out of the view to the right. The Earth pulls the moon toward it and the moon's movement keeps it in orbit. But using the universal law of gravitation, we discover that the Sun's gravitational force on the moon is greater than the Earth's. This would make you wonder why the moon keeps coming back around the Earth instead of falling toward the Sun. When I first encountered this problem, I was not inclined to dismiss the universal law of gravitation simply because the answer wasn't immediately evident. Ralph Rene, however, felt that his inability to answer the question must mean that Newton and all the astrophysicists since his time have been wrong. It's understandable why someone would be confounded by this, but there is an answer. If the Earth was pinned to a solid background, the moon would certainly fall toward the Sun. The mystery here is caused by the fact that we perceive this as a static system, just like this illustration. But the Earth is not sitting still. It is orbiting the Sun at 30 kilometers per second, with the moon in tow. The net result of the moon's orbital speed around the Earth and its speed around the Sun shows that it is actually moving at 29 kilometers per second in this direction around the Sun. When it's on the far side of the Earth from the Sun, it is moving at 31 kilometers per second with respect to the Sun. The Earth's gravity is enough to cause the moon to keep coming back around when both are moving around the Sun as a single system at an average speed of 30 kilometers per second. In fact, if you removed the Earth completely, the moon would continue to orbit the Sun in a nearly circular path.
Doesn't want to move. Can't bend it backwards. I can hardly force it down, and I can make a fist, but you can't hold it. And you could never pick. I mean, how could you pick up small screws and bolts like they've shown them to do, or trigger a little tiny trigger on a camera with the glove doing this?
Sorry, but they didn't have to pick up small screws and bolts, and the shutter releases on the cameras were built way oversized, so they could use them with the gloves. NASA actually figures these kinds of things out in advance. And if Ralph was alive today, I'm sure he'd be eager to answer the question of how did dozens of other astronauts in the shuttle program, Mir, and the International Space Station manage to do their EVA tasks with essentially the same kind of gloves that Apollo had. Here's one of Ralph Rene's photographic complaints. He noticed that the astronaut seems to have no shadow. At first, that would seem strange, but one would have to wonder why, if it was faked on Earth, he would have no shadow. Well, there's an explanation for it. This astronaut was jumping as he saluted the flag. These clips from video of the same scene show that he is jumping up and down. This is typical of the kind of care and research that hoax proponents go to when presenting their evidence. Rene and many others who deny the moon landings often use the absence of stars in photographs to bolster their claims. The original moon hoax theorist, Bill Kaysing, considered it his strongest evidence that we never went to the moon. Again, these arguments are not the result of their great powers of logic and observation. They are based on ignorance of photography. Cameras are set to exposures that reveal the surface of the moon and bright objects, not the stars. To illustrate this, I have filmed snow falling and some lights in the distance. The snow is lit up pretty well by a nearby street light. The flakes are brighter than any stars would appear, and the lights in the distance are much brighter still. When I put a piece of paper in front of the camera, simulating the surface of the moon, and shine a flashlight on it from about 2 feet away, you can see that the snow disappears. This is because the camera has an automatic exposure setting, which is now being affected by the bright foreground. Even the distant lights disappear. Keep in mind, this lit piece of paper is nowhere near as bright as the surface of the moon would appear to the astronauts' cameras. Our eyes do much the same as this camera, which is why the astronauts do not see stars as long as there are bright objects in their field of view. Some conspiracy theorists actually go so far as to say that the Challenger explosion was deliberately committed in order to silence Christa McAuliffe, because she was allegedly going to tell everybody that she could see stars in space. This is profoundly insulting and utterly stupid. If you are looking toward black sky, you will see stars in space. But most of the time there are bright objects in your field of view, which will cause your eyes to adjust, much like my camera did, but to a somewhat smaller degree. Conspiracy theorists don't seem to feel the least bit embarrassed to claim that NASA murdered all of these fine people as well as the Apollo 1 crew just to shut up Christa McAuliffe and Gus Grissom. Oh sure, NASA would have blown up a space shuttle and killed 6 other people when they could have given her a stomach virus or food poisoning a couple of days before the launch. Then, if her backup, Barb Morgan, wasn't a team player, they could have done something just as subtle and relatively harmless to her, and simply said they would have to wait until another time for the Teacher in Space project. NASA would not have even had to do anything harmful to keep someone quiet. They could have just told Christa that her blood sugar level was too low or that her white blood count was too high. How anyone can believe these outrageous and offensive claims is utterly beyond my ability to comprehend. Rene also claims that Einstein's general theory of relativity was wrong. The scientific community received this about as well as they received his claims about gravitation. And in the tradition of all frustrated, envious, egomaniacal, paranoid crackpots with delusions of grandeur, Rene was convinced the entire scientific community was conspiring against him because his ideas would overthrow the current paradigm and disrupt the scientific status quo, as he called it. Einstein himself was not satisfied with his theory and spent much of his later career trying to improve it. He failed. It is highly unlikely that someone of Rene's caliber is ever going to succeed where Einstein and a legion of brilliant physicists since his time have failed. Rene's webpage summarizes several of his prominent claims and reads like a grievance against the entire scientific community. Shown here in the same Comic Sans typeface he used on his webpage are his descriptions of the real experts he has had contact with, and the number of times he used each description. This is hardly the language of a top scholar, and does illustrate how multi-undisciplined he was. The third and final segment of this tribute explores more of Rene's claims.